I need your clothes, your boots, and your motorcycle. Well, as an inhabitant of Arnold's land, I guess I had a duty to play the latest adaptation of Terminator 2. Actually, it piqued my interest because it seemed like the next in a string of revivals, like Turtles or He-Man, building surprisingly solid retro-looking games around classic multimedia franchises. Terminator 2D looked surprisingly faithful to those licensed games you'd rent for your Super Nintendo or Mega Drive back in the day. However, the game's structure also looked somewhat all over the place in trailers. Without getting ahead of myself, let's just say it's not a tumor, but it's also not a full home run. Arguably, the game is kind of emblematic of some of the core problems of these indie developed throwbacks. At this point, developers have figured out the basics when it comes to pseudo-retro games, especially side-scrollers. Terminator 2D also got the basics down. It's a solid action platformer with satisfying hit feedback and enemy patterns, responsive controls, and great pixel art. By default, it's a motivating game for an afternoon. However, I don't expect a big, lasting legacy. Unlike games such as Sonic Mania, which really embraced the core game design of the past, for many other titles this pixel design is more of a pastiche. This is often most obvious in the visuals that don't really feel like the classic games they're paying homage to. Now, Terminator 2D gets this better than other games. It wouldn't have run on a Super Nintendo or Mega Drive, but a similar visual style on stronger machines from that era, like Neo Geo or PS1, might not be too far-fetched, as long as you ignore the widescreen and some very advanced animations. I was only put off by the soundtrack, which is full of orchestra and dubstep versions of the movie themes. If you want to go the full way, there should have been MIDI sound files, but that's just a nitpick. When it comes to gameplay, it's also surprisingly authentic in some places. You don't get a full 360-degree aiming range, and this is one of the first titles in a while that dares to use continues instead of save files. As much as it is a love letter to Terminator 2, recreating all of the movie's action scenes and even some alternative scenarios, the game is also a big homage to all the side-scrolling classics. Here you've got the homing attack from Gunstar Heroes, here's one of a dozen Contra throwbacks, here's a Metal Slug boss, the shooting with Sarah Connor feels tactical like Shinobi, and it has stealth and brawling too. But again, the problem is, this is retro pastiche for its own sake. The levels have so many throwbacks and elements, no single gameplay style can evolve. Only the last couple of stages introduce more sophisticated level scenarios, but most of these game styles only appear briefly and remain shallow. Plus, it's extremely easy on normal difficulty. On the hard mode, the enemy patterns and obstacle placements feel much more finely tuned and much more satisfying. However, with 15 stages, this continue-based single-run concept doesn't make sense anymore. Again, it seems to be there as a throwback, not as a necessary design choice. Something like Streets of Rage 2 or Shadow Dancer, which are some of the most replayable single-run games, are much shorter and focus on a single game style. Terminator 2D is a decent romp, and it's a fun gimmick to play the movie in 2D multiple decades later. However, with its overall kind of undercooked foundation, it might not be something that sticks with players for too long. I guess in that sense it actually is pretty close to those licensed games you'd get in rental stores, because those were also rarely on par with the classics.